In 2014, Sony announced PlayStation Now to the world. Players will be able to stream games on consoles, TVs, and even their smartphones, but it's no longer available, so what happened? Stay tuned for the history of PlayStation Now. January 7th, 2014. The Consumer Electronics Show was being held at the Las Vegas Convention Center. Now this is an annual expo where companies can show off their new technologies and products. LG was showing off their 77-inch curved OLED TV, AMD showed the world their new Kaveri CPUs, and Sony unveiled a state-of-the-art streaming service, which they called PlayStation Now. You would be able to stream the most popular games as well as classics from the PS3. At launch, the service would only be available on the PS3 and PS4, but would come to the PS Vita at a later date. But if you didn't own a console, don't worry, as Sony had you covered. A range of Sony Bravia TVs had the PS Now app built in, so you'd be able to game straight from your TV as long as you had a controller. But even that wasn't enough for Sony. They believed if it had a screen, well, then it's a PlayStation. The Sony Xperia tablets and mobile phones were also launching later in the year, and well, you guessed it, you'd be able to play God of War in one hand whilst drinking a beer in the other. But how was this even possible? Well, that's where Gaikai comes into the picture. Gaikai are a tech company that specialised in cloud gaming as well as streaming. In 2012, they were acquired by Sony for $380 million, and they got to work straight away. They were tasked with designing and implementing the PS Now service, remote play as well as SharePlay. Yes, these guys also made SharePlay, which to this day is a great feature. But let's get back to the announcement. Sony showed demonstrations of The Last of Us, God of War Ascension, and Beyond Two Souls, all powered by PlayStation Now. Closed beta testing started in January on the PS3 and was pushed out to the PS4 in May. But what would allow the games to function across all of these devices from a technical perspective? Well, Sony started by placing ordinary PS3s into data centers. This is where the servers, networking, and operations of PlayStation Now came to fruition. But this wasn't going to work for a few reasons. The first was the size of a PS3. To house loads of PS3s in the data center would take up far too much space. There was also the issue of power consumption. One PS3 would eat 80 watts from the mains, so they had to go back to the drawing board. But that wasn't even the worst of the issues. You see, a PS3 game runs at 30 frames per second. You then need to accost for input latency at around 150 milliseconds, and then add the cloud overhead into the mix, and you start to get a very laggy experience that no one would enjoy. Gaikai had to work with Sony engineers to develop a new system. This system was a single motherboard that had the power of 8 PlayStation 3s and was confined to a single server rack. That means it was far more efficient in terms of its size and usability, as opposed to housing tons of PS3s. With the closed beta testing out of the way, it was time for the open beta. This launched in the United States and Canada from July to October in 2014. It was available on the PS4, PS3, PS Vita, and PlayStation TV. And on a side note, does anyone remember the PlayStation TV? If you are interested in watching a deep dive on the PS TV, let me know in the comments and I'll see what I can do. But getting back on topic, PlayStation Now's open beta wasn't available on Bravia TVs. They were still doing some work in the background to ensure the app would function as it's supposed to. The year is 2014 and Gamescom is taking place in Cologne, Germany. 2K Games were getting people hyped for Evolve, Activision was showing off a small title called Destiny, and Sega were demonstrating Alien Isolation. But what about Sony? Surely they didn't turn up to the raffle without a ticket. Well, Sony announced that PlayStation Now would launch in Europe in 2015, with the United Kingdom getting it first. Now, being that I'm from the United Kingdom, you'd think that I was over the moon with this announcement, but I wasn't, because I was playing Destiny like everyone else in the world. In December 2014, Sony announced that PlayStation Now would expand to other electronic brands. This meant you could use the service on your Apple products and a range of other phones and branded TVs. Now, this was very ambitious on Sony's end, but everyone dreams big, right? A year on from PS Now being revealed at the Consumer Electronics Show, it was only right that Sony came back to discuss its launch. This took place on the 6th of January 2015, and Sony announced that PlayStation Now would launch a week later in North America. Europe didn't get their hands on the service until March later in the year. But what did the gaming world as well as journalists have to say about PlayStation Now? Was it any good? Did it function properly? Was it worth the money? Well, this wouldn't be a very informative video if I didn't answer these questions. Will Greenwald of PC Mag gave PlayStation Now 3.5 out of 5. He stated that it works impressively well, but you need a fast internet connection to get the most out of it. He went on to say that for $20 a month, the price was justified because of the quality of games on offer, of which there are over 100 PS3 titles. He did, however, criticise the lack of recent AAA games that didn't make the final cut. But overall, he rated the service as good and did recommend it. Digital Foundry also tested out PlayStation Now and had mixed experiences depending on which game they played. They also carried out a ton of research, and I just want to credit credit them before I begin. Digital Foundry's breakdown is a bit more extensive, so I'll try and keep this next section brief. Technically speaking, gameplay was streamed at 720p resolution at 60fps via Sony's data center. This stream is then captured on the user's console or device even if the game itself was capped at 30fps. So depending on if your internet connection was good enough and met the 5MB bandwidth quota, depended on how the game would play. Slow-moving games with a limited colour palette would typically play pretty well, but faster-moving games with a lot of motion could appear choppy with artifacts appearing on the screen. Sony also used the same H.264 video encoder on every single game in the library. Whilst this could look great on 30fps titles like Batman Arkham City, 60fps titles like Ultra Street Fighter 4 had a lot of input lag. Playing Street Fighter locally on your PS3, you'd have around 70 milliseconds of input lag, but on the PS Now service that would spike up to 150 milliseconds of latency. Combos were inconsistent and the last thing you want is input lag on a fighting game. However, one area that PlayStation Now was better in was load times. In some games, load times were 3 times better than running the game locally. This was due to the improved storage solutions that Sony's server-side infrastructure could handle. Yes, that was a lot of S's in such a short sentence, but we got there, baby. Digital Foundry claimed that each user's experience of PS Now would vary. Internet speed, types of TV or monitor used, and Sony's network and infrastructure, well, they'd all play a significant part. Even with the technical limitations, they stated PS Now was an impressive piece of tech. For the next 2 years, PlayStation Now was doing very well, with subs increasing by approximately 40% each year. However, they decided to cancel the service on the PS3, PS Vita, PS TV, as well as their Bravia TVs and Blu-ray players. But if they were doing so well, then why did they decide to discontinue the service on certain devices? Well, Sony wanted to focus their time on the PS4 and PC communities. They believed they could further develop and improve players' experience on these two devices. Sony offered a heartfelt thank you for supporting them and stated your cloud saves, they could be accessed on either of these platforms. But if you didn't own a PS4 or PC, well, your cloud saves wouldn't be of any use. Now, whilst that statement was true, let me break it down further. The hardware of these devices had limited capabilities and couldn't provide a quality streaming experience, well, not good enough for Sony anyways. It made more sense to refine the service and cater towards newer consoles and PCs which could handle PlayStation Now's demands. In 2018, Sony had another PS Now announcement. Players would be able to download PS2 and PS4 games onto their PS4 as well as being able to stream them. This meant you wouldn't have to worry about the speed of your internet as well as playing the games offline. Bloodborne, God of War 3 Remastered and classic PS2 titles would all be available. There were some other benefits to downloading these games as opposed to streaming them. You could play the games in native resolution or in 4K if supported. Audio enthusiasts with a 5:1 surround sound setup would be happy, as yes, this was also supported. Now remember, at this time there was also PlayStation Plus. This was another sub-service that allowed gamers to play online, get a couple of free games each month, as well as some store discounts. You didn't need a PS Plus sub to play PS Now games online. However, you would need to verify your PS Now sub once a week to continue playing games offline. But to summarise, PlayStation had two different paid services. You needed one for online play, unless you were playing a game on PS Now, in which case you could play the game online. Well, what if you wanted both services? Could you get a discount for the two? And the answer to that was no. So not only was Sony battling Xbox's Game Pass, they also added themselves to the list of competitors. Despite Sony announcing PS Now would launch in Europe in 2015, PS Now was only available in 9 countries, and for those that don't know, there are 44 countries in Europe. It wouldn't be until 2019 where the other parts of Europe, including Italy, Spain and Portugal, would have access to PlayStation Now. Take into consideration that Microsoft's Game Pass, Sony's main competitor, was available in over 100 countries and more than 50% of European countries. So not only was Sony late to the race, they weren't even in a race to begin with. Launching a streaming service around the world requires a lot of resources, money and infrastructure to be created, and whilst they did have the money, they were still trying to play catch up. 2 years later, in April 2021, Sony added 1080p streaming support. Now this was a huge upgrade from 720p, especially since 1080p had been the industry standard since 2014. Yes, I know we have 8K nowadays, but 1080p at 60 frames, it still looks pretty good. Months after the 1080p announcement, Sony dropped a bombshell. They were launching a new paid service called Project Spartacus. Now this would merge PlayStation Plus and PlayStation Now. Since PS Plus had been around since 2010 with good brand recognition, Sony decided to stick with this name. The service would have 3 tiers that players could choose from. The first was PlayStation Essential. This provided players online multiplayer access, monthly games, discounts as well as cloud storage. Next was the Extra tier. This provided all the benefits from the Essential tier, but also gave access to over 400 PS4 and PS5 games. Now these also included Sony's first party first-party games, as well as some third-party releases. You'd also be able to download these games onto your console and wouldn't need to worry about stream quality as well as internet speeds. The last tier was PlayStation Premium. You'd of course have the benefits from the other tiers combined, but you gained access to more than 340 classic games from the PS1, PS2, PS3 and PSP. Now you could download these games, but the PS3 titles could only be streamed. This was because the PS3 used a completely different type of CPU, and the modern consoles didn't have an integrated emulator. You also had access to time-limited game trials. Now PlayStation Now had essentially, pardon the pun, been replaced with the premium tier subscription, which objectively offered a far better product. The following year, in March 2022, Sony announced a merger, with it taking place between May and June. As of March 2023, PS Plus has over 47.4 million users, which nets Sony $3.5 billion each year. So there you have it, the tale of PlayStation Now. I hope you've all enjoyed it, and if you did, consider leaving a like on the video. If you'd like to see more content like this, then by all means hit the subscribe button. Also, let me know if you'd like to see a deep dive on PlayStation TV, as I think that would be a pretty good idea. My next video will be a game review, so I hope to see you all there. Until next time guys, peace out.
I'm pleased to announce the new streaming game service, PlayStation Now.